In 1887, in the wild territory of Wyoming, Jacob Miller struggles to keep his small ranch after years of devastating drought. When he finds an injured native woman on his land, his decision to give away his only horse, his last hope for survival, sets in motion a series of events that will transform not only his life, but also reveal the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and unexpected redemption in the arid lands of the American West. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when Jacob Miller stepped onto his porch, and already he could feel the weight of another day pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold hours ago, but he kept sipping it anyway, staring out at what used to be his pride and joy. 3 years. 3 years since the last good rain had blessed this corner of Wyoming territory, and Jacob's small ranch looked like God himself had forgotten it existed. Where green pastures once stretched toward the mountains, now only cracked earth and stubborn weeds survived. The wooden fence posts stood like tombstones marking the death of his dreams, and the barn that once housed 12 head of cattle now sheltered only dust and memories. He ran his weathered hand through graying hair and tried not to think about the letter in his pocket. The bank's final notice had arrived yesterday, written in that cold official language that rich men in suits used when they were about to destroy a man's life. 30 days. That's all he had left before they'd come with their papers and their sheriff, ready to take everything his father had built with his own hands. "Easy, girl," Jacob murmured as his mare Belle nickered softly from the small corral beside the house. She was all he had left now, 15 years old, with a coat the color of autumn wheat, and eyes that seemed to understand his troubles better than any human ever had. The bank couldn't touch her because she wasn't listed as collateral, but what good was owning a horse when you had no land to ride her on? He was about to head back inside when something caught his eye near the creek bed that ran along his eastern boundary. A flash of movement, too big to be a coyote, too deliberate to be the wind playing tricks with the sagebrush. Jacob set down his cup and walked toward the barn, where his father's old rifle hung on wooden pegs. The metal was cold against his palm as he checked the chamber, still loaded from yesterday when he'd spotted wolf tracks near Belle's corral. These days, a man couldn't be too careful, especially a man living alone with nothing but his horse and his failing dreams for company. The morning air carried the scent of dried earth and dying grass as he made his way toward the creek. His boots crunched softly on the parched ground, and with each step, the strange form became clearer. What he'd taken for an animal was actually a person, lying motionless near the water's edge. Jacob's grip tightened on the rifle as he approached. In this part of Wyoming, strangers usually meant trouble, and trouble was the last thing he could afford right now. But as he got closer, his caution gave way to something else entirely. It was a woman, and she was hurt bad. She lay on her side, her long black hair matted with blood and dirt, wearing traditional native dress that had been torn and stained with what looked like days of hard travel. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible, and when Jacob knelt beside her, he could see the fever burning in her dark skin. "Mom?" he said softly, setting his rifle aside. "Mom, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes filled with pain and something else Jacob recognized all too well, the desperate look of someone who'd lost everything and was still fighting to survive. She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper in what sounded like Shoshone. Jacob had picked up enough of the language from his dealings with the tribes over the years to catch a few words: water, help, and something that might have been dying. Without hesitation, Jacob scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than Belle's saddle, all bones and sinew beneath the damaged fabric of her dress. As he carried her toward his house, she mumbled something else, and this time he understood it clearly. "Horse," she whispered in English, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "Need horse." Jacob's heart clenched. Of all the things she could have asked for, water, food, medicine, shelter, she was asking for the one thing that would finish him completely. He laid her gently on his own bed, the only real bed in the small house, and began tending to her wounds with what supplies he had. There was a gash on her forehead that needed cleaning, bruises along her arms that spoke of rough handling, and when he helped her sip some water, he noticed her lips were cracked from days without proper drink. As he worked, she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering in her native tongue, sometimes staring at him with those intense eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. It wasn't until evening, when he'd managed to get some broth down her throat and clean her wounds properly, that she spoke clearly again. "My people," she said, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "They wait 3 days' ride north, no horses left, children, hungry. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. He'd heard the stories, knew that many of the local tribes were struggling just as badly as the white settlers, maybe worse. The government's promises had proved as empty as his own rain barrels, and winter was coming fast. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ayana," she replied, "means eternal blossom." A bitter smile crossed her cracked lips. Nothing eternal now, all dying. That night, Jacob sat on his porch again, but this time he wasn't thinking about his own troubles. Inside his house, a woman who'd lost everything was sleeping in his bed, and outside in the corral, Belle was the only thing standing between Ayana's people and complete disaster. He thought about his father, who'd always said that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to give up for others. He thought about the bank notice in his pocket and the look in Ayana's eyes when she'd whispered about the hungry children. The decision, when it came to him in the quiet darkness before dawn, felt as inevitable as the sunrise. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Wyoming territory, and Jacob found himself standing in Belle's corral with a heavy heart and a heavier decision weighing on his shoulders. The mare nuzzled his palm, looking for the sugar cube he usually brought her each morning, but today his pockets held nothing but lint and regret. Inside the house, Ayana was awake, sitting up in bed despite his protests that she needed more rest. Her fever had broken during the night, but Jacob could see the urgency burning in her dark eyes, like a flame that refused to be extinguished. "You don't understand," she said when he brought her coffee and the last of his bread. "My brother, he leads them now. Young men, angry men. They say the white man's promises are dust, that we should take what we need." She gripped the tin cup with both hands, as if drawing strength from its warmth. 3 days. That's all the time I bought them. 3 days to find horses or they ride to war. Jacob felt his stomach drop. He'd lived in this territory long enough to know what that meant. The cavalry posts were scattered thin, and if Ayana's people decided to raid for horses and supplies, it would bring down hell on every ranch and settlement within 100 miles. "How many are we talking about?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. 40 families, maybe 50. Children, elders, warriors. Ayana's voice cracked slightly. "They trusted me to find another way. I promised them I would." Jacob walked to the window and stared out at Belle, who was now grazing on the sparse grass near the fence. 15 years old, gentle as a lamb, and worth more than his life in the current situation. If he gave her up, he'd be walking to town when the bank came calling. No way to work other ranches, no way to earn money, no way to start over anywhere else. But if he didn't, "There's something else," Ayana said quietly. "The reason they're so desperate. The reason my brother sent me instead of coming himself." Jacob turned back to her, and the expression on her face made his blood run cold. "The cavalry burned our winter stores last month. Said we were hiding stolen goods, but it was just dried meat and corn we'd saved for the cold months." Her hands trembled as she set down the cup. "They took our horses too, every last one, left us with nothing but pride, and pride doesn't feed children." The weight of her words settled over Jacob like a shroud. He'd heard rumors about overzealous officers, men who saw every native as a potential threat, but he'd hoped they were just stories. Apparently not. "Ayana," he said carefully, "if I give you Belle, if I do this thing, what guarantee do I have that your people won't come back for more? That they won't see my ranch as an easy target?" She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, a recognition that seemed to pierce straight through all his defenses. "You're afraid," she said simply, "not of death, of losing what little you have left." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I'm not. This land is dying too," Ayana continued, gesturing toward the window. "I can see it in the earth, smell it in the wind. And you're holding on to something that's already gone, aren't you?" The words hit him like a physical blow. How could this woman, this stranger who'd stumbled onto his land more dead than alive, read his situation so clearly? If you've ever felt like you're fighting a losing battle, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. Sometimes we all need to know we're not alone in our struggles. "The bank," he admitted quietly, 30 days and they take everything." Ayana nodded as if she'd already known. "So we're both dying then? Your ranch, my people. The question is, do we die with honor or do we die having done nothing?" Jacob turned away from her knowing gaze and walked back to the window. Belle had wandered closer to the house, and she lifted her head when she saw him, ears pricked forward expectantly. 15 years they'd been together, through his wife's death, through the drought, through every small disaster that had chipped away at his life piece by piece. "She's all I have left," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Ayana replied firmly. She's all you think you have left. But a man who would take in a dying stranger, who would risk everything for people he's never met, that man has something no bank can take away. Jacob closed his eyes and tried to imagine riding Belle away from this place when the time came, leaving behind everything his father had built. Then he tried to imagine Ayana returning to her people empty-handed, watching them ride to a war they couldn't win. Neither image brought him any peace. When he opened his eyes again, Ayana was standing beside him, moving carefully but with determined strength. There's something my grandmother used to say, she told him, that the spirits remember every act of kindness, every moment when someone chooses love over fear. She said those moments echo through time, creating ripples we can't even imagine. And you believe that? Jacob asked. Ayana smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her, it reached her eyes. I believe that sometimes the only way to save ourselves is to save someone else first. Outside, Belle nickered softly, as if she could sense the weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. Jacob watched her for a long moment, memorizing the way the morning light caught the silver in her mane, the patient trust in her brown eyes. Then he walked to the wooden peg by the door and took down Belle's bridle. "Can you ride?" he asked without looking back at Ayana. "I can ride," she said quietly. Jacob's hands shook slightly as he lifted the leather reins, feeling their familiar weight one last time. "Then let's go save your people." The morning air bit sharp and cold as Jacob led Belle from the corral, each step feeling like he was walking toward the edge of a cliff. Ayana moved beside him with surprising grace for someone who'd been half dead just hours before, but he could see the pain she was hiding behind her determined expression. Belle seemed to sense something was different. She kept turning her head back toward Jacob, her ears swiveling with confusion as he helped Ayana into the worn leather saddle. The mare had never carried anyone but him, and the sight of another person on her back sent an unexpected stab of grief through his chest. "She's beautiful," Ayana said, running her hand along Belle's neck. "What's her name?" "Belle," Jacob replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "After my wife, Isabella." He paused, memories threatening to overwhelm him. Belle was going to be her horse. I bought her the week before the fever took Isabella away." Ayana's hand stilled on the mare's mane. "She would be proud of what you're doing." Jacob wasn't so sure about that. Isabella had always been the practical one, the one who planned for winter and counted every penny. She might have called him a fool for giving away their last chance at survival. But then again, she'd also been the one who left food on their doorstep for struggling neighbors who'd never turned away anyone in need. "There's something you need to know," Jacob said, reaching into his saddlebags and pulling out an old cavalry map of the territory. "The route north, and it's not going to be easy. There are 3 cavalry patrols between here and where your people are camped, and if they see you, they'll shoot first and ask questions later," Ayana finished. "I know. That's why I came this way in the first place, through the canyon passes where the soldiers don't like to ride." Jacob spread the map across Belle's neck, pointing to a winding trail that snaked between 2 mountain ridges. "This path here, it'll add half a day to your journey, but it keeps you away from the main routes. Follow Willow Creek until you reach the split rocks, then head northwest through the pine forest." Ayana studied the map carefully, tracing the route with her finger. As she leaned forward, Jacob noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh rope burns around her wrists, mostly healed but still visible. "Ayana," he said quietly, "what really happened to you out there? How did you end up on my land?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she pulled back her sleeves, revealing more marks, bruises that were yellow with age, scratches that spoke of desperate escape. "The cavalry patrol that burned our stores, they took some of our women." Her voice was steady, but Jacob could hear the steel underneath. "Said we were hostages to guarantee good behavior from our warriors. They kept us at Fort Morrison in cells meant for deserters and criminals." Jacob felt sick. "How did you get away?" "The guard got careless, thought a woman wouldn't fight back." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "He was wrong, but I had to leave the others behind. Had to choose between saving them and saving everyone." The weight of her sacrifice hit Jacob like a physical blow. This woman had given up her freedom, her safety, everything, for the slim chance that she could find help for her people. And now he was sending her back into danger on the back of his most precious possession. "Take this too," he said, unbuckling his gun belt and handing it to her. "It's not much, but—" "I can't take your weapon," Ayana protested. "You can, and you will." Jacob's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "Belle's fast, but she can't outrun bullets. If you run into trouble, he showed her how to work the mechanism, how to aim, though something told him she already knew. Don't hesitate. Don't try to wound. These men won't show you mercy. Ayana secured the gun belt around her waist, and suddenly she looked less like a victim and more like what Jacob suspected she'd always been, a warrior in her own right. There's one more thing, she said, reaching into a small pouch at her side and pulling out a piece of carved bone hanging from a leather cord. This was my grandmother's. She said it would protect the bearer from harm, but only if their heart was pure. She lifted it over her head and placed it around Jacob's neck. The bone was warm from her body heat and carved with symbols he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Protection, courage, sacrifice. I can't take this, Jacob said, echoing her earlier words. Yes, you can, because what you're doing today, it's going to have consequences. My people, when they learn what you've done, they'll remember. And there are others out there, other tribes, other desperate people who will hear this story. Her eyes met his with an intensity that made him shiver. You're going to need protection more than I am. If what you're hearing moves you, tell me from which city or country you're following this story. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. Belle stamped impatiently, sensing the urgency in the air. The sun was climbing higher, and every minute that passed was a minute closer to whatever deadline Ayana's brother had set. One last thing, Jacob said, pulling an old cloth bag from his pocket. Sugar cubes. Belle's got a sweet tooth, and she'll do anything for one. If you need her to run faster, to jump higher, to push beyond what she thinks she can do, he pressed the bag into Ayana's hand. Just remember that. Ayana looked down at the simple gift, and Jacob saw tears gather in her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Jacob stepped back and looked up at her sitting on Belle's back, this fierce woman who'd risked everything for her people, mounted on the horse that represented everything he was losing. Because, he said simply, sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that lets you sleep at night. Ayana gathered the reins, and Belle danced sideways, eager to run. Jacob Miller, she said, the spirits will remember this day. Then she was gone, and Jacob was left standing in his empty corral, watching the dust cloud that marked the disappearance of his last hope and his greatest act of faith. The silence that followed Ayana's departure was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of Belle's familiar sounds, her gentle nickering, the rhythmic thud of her hooves, the creak of leather when she shifted in her stall. It was the silence of a man who had just given away his last connection to hope. Jacob stood in the empty corral for what felt like hours, staring at the dust that had already settled back to earth. The carved bone pendant hung heavy around his neck, warm against his chest like a second heartbeat. He touched it absently, wondering if Ayana had already reached the canyon passes, if Belle was carrying her safely toward whatever awaited them in the northern wilderness. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, and Jacob retreated to his porch with a cup of water. Coffee was a luxury he could no longer afford. The bank notice crinkled in his pocket as he sat down, a constant reminder that in 29 days, everything he was looking at would belong to someone else. He was contemplating the bitter irony of losing his land just after giving away his only means of escape when he heard them. Horses. Many horses. Jacob's blood turned to ice as he counted the dust clouds rising from the eastern horizon. Too many to be a normal patrol, too organized to be rustlers. As they drew closer, he could make out individual riders, and his worst fears crystallized into terrifying reality. Warriors, at least 50 of them, maybe more, riding in formation with the practiced ease of men who'd spent their lives in the saddle. War paint streaked their faces, and weapons glinted in the afternoon sun. They moved like a storm front across the prairie, and they were heading straight for his ranch. Jacob's hand instinctively reached for where his gun belt should have been, then dropped uselessly to his side. He was unarmed, alone, and had apparently just sent his horse to the very people who were now surrounding his property. The riders formed a perfect circle around his house, their horses snorting and stamping with barely contained energy. Jacob forced himself to stand slowly, keeping his hands visible, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. The warrior who rode forward was younger than Jacob had expected, maybe 30 years old, with Ayana's same dark eyes, but harder, colder. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and when he spoke, his English was precise and unforgiving. "You are Jacob Miller," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Jacob replied, proud that his voice remained steady. "I am Takoda, brother to Ayana." She tells me you gave her your horse. The warrior's eyes swept over the empty corral, the modest house, the clear signs of a man barely surviving. She tells me you asked for nothing in return. Jacob nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Around him, the other warriors sat motionless on their horses, but he could feel their tension like electricity in the air. Do you know what this means? Takoda continued, dismounting with fluid grace. Do you understand what you have done? I helped someone who needed help, Jacob said simply. Something flickered in Takoda's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. My sister also tells me that you are about to lose this land, that the white man's bank will take it from you. Jacob's jaw tightened. Of course, Ayana would have noticed the signs, would have understood his desperation. That's my problem, not yours. Perhaps, Takoda said, walking closer. But you made it our problem when you chose to save my people instead of yourself. Before Jacob could respond, Takoda raised his hand, and the sound that followed nearly brought Jacob to his knees. Horses, hundreds of horses. They came from every direction, over the hills, around the barn, through the creek bed. Not wild horses, but broken, ridden, magnificent animals that moved with the discipline of cavalry mounts. Their riders were warriors, but also women, children, elders, an entire community that had apparently materialized out of the empty Wyoming landscape. Where? Jacob began, but Takoda held up a hand for silence. Fort Morrison, the warrior said with grim satisfaction. The same fort where they kept my sister and the others prisoner. The same fort where they stored the horses they stole from every tribe in the territory. His smile was sharp as a blade. They will not be needing them anymore. Jacob's mind reeled. You raided a cavalry fort. We liberated what was already ours, Takoda corrected. And in the process we found something interesting. He gestured, and two warriors rode forward leading a familiar figure. Belle, with Ayana still in the saddle, but now surrounded by more horses than Jacob had ever seen in one place. Ayana slipped down from Belle's back and walked toward them, and Jacob could see something different in her bearing. Not just the relief of a successful mission, but the quiet confidence of someone who had helped orchestrate something extraordinary. The fort commander had records, she said, producing a leather satchel. Documents showing which ranches were failing, which ones the bank was planning to foreclose on. Your name was on the list, Jacob, along with 12 others. She opened the satchel and pulled out official-looking papers, but also something else, bags that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. The cavalry was being paid bounties, Takoda explained, for every homestead that failed, every family that gave up and moved on, more empty land for the territorial government to sell to railroad companies. The implications hit Jacob like a physical blow. His failure, his neighbors' struggles, the drought that had lasted just a little too long. It hadn't all been bad luck. It had been orchestrated. This is your share, Ayana said, pressing one of the bags into his hands. Payment for services rendered to the people of this territory. Jacob looked down at the gold coins, then back up at the hundreds of horses and riders surrounding his property. I can't take this. I didn't do what I did for money. We know, Takoda said simply. That's exactly why you must take it. What comes next will change everything for Jacob, and to not miss how this incredible story ends, tap that subscribe button now. It's free, and you'll be with me for every new story. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming territory, Jacob stood in his corral once again, but this time he wasn't alone. Belle nuzzled his shoulder as if she'd never been away, and around them, an entire community had gathered to witness something that would be remembered for generations. The spirits, it seemed, really did remember every act of kindness.